Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Chapter 6. Several contrivances of the author to please the king and queen. He shews his skill in music. The king inquires into the state of Europe, which the author relates to him. The author's observations thereon. I used to attend the king's levee once or twice a week, and often seen him under the barber's hand, which indeed was at a very terrible to behold, for the razor was almost twice as long as an ordinary scythe. His Majesty, according to the custom of the country, was only shaved twice a week. I once prevailed on the barber to give him some of the studs or lather, out of which I picked 40 or 50 of the strongest stumps of hair. I then took a piece of fine wood and cut it in the back of a comb, making several holes in equal distance, with as small a needle as I could get from Glumdalclitch. I fixed in the stumps so artificially, scraping and slopping them with my knife towards the points, that I made a very tolerable comb, which was a seasonable supply, my own being very much broken in the teeth, that it was almost useless. Neither did I know any artist in that country so nice and exact that would undertake to make me another. And this put me in the mind of amusement, wherein I spent many of my leisure hours, as I desired from the Queen's woman to save me the combing of her Majesty's hair, whereof in time I got a good quantity, in consulting my friend the cabinet maker, who had received general orders to do little jobs for me. I directed him to make 2 chair frames, no larger than those I had put in my box, and to them bore little holes with a fine awl round those parts where I designed the backs and seats. Through these holes I wove the strongest hairs I could pick out, just after the manner of the cane chairs in England. When they were finished, I made a present of them to her Majesty, who kept them in her cabinet, and used to shew them for curiosity, as indeed they were the wonder of everyone that beheld them. The Queen would have had me sit upon one of these chairs, but I absolutely refused to obey her, protesting that I'd rather die 1,000 deaths than place a dishonourable part of my body in one of those precious hairs that once adorned her Majesty's head. One of these hairs, as I was always a mechanical genius, I likewise made a neat little purse, about 5 foot long, with her Majesty's name deciphered in gold letters, which I gave to Glumdalclitch by the Queen's consent. To say the truth, it was more for shew than use, being not of strength to bear the weight of the larger coins, and therefore she kept nothing in it, but some little toys that girls were fond of. The king, who was delighted in music, had frequent concerts at court, to which I was sometimes carried, and set in my box on the table to hear them. But the noise was so great that I could hardly distinguish the tunes. I am confident that all the drums and trumpets of the royal army, beating and sounding together just at your ears, could not equal it. My practice was to have my box removed from the places where the performers sat, as far as I could, then to shut the windows and doors of it, and draw the window curtains, after which I found their music not disagreeable. I had learned in my youth to play a little upon the spinet. Glumdalclitch kept one in her chamber, and a master attended twice a week to teach her. I called it a spinet, but it somewhat resembled that instrument, and was played upon in the same manner. A fancy came into my head that I would entertain the king and the queen with an English tune upon this instrument. But this appeared extremely difficult, for the spinet was near 60 foot long, each key being almost a foot wide, so that, with my arms extended, I could not reach above 5 keys, and to press them down would require a good smart stroke of my fist, which would be too great a labor. And to no purpose, the method I contrived was this. I prepared 2 round sticks, about the bigness of a common cudgel. They were thicker at one end than the other, and I covered the thicker ends with a piece of mouse's skin, that by wrapping them I neither damaged the top of the keys, nor interrupt the sound. Before the spinet a bench was placed about 4 foot below the keys, and I was put upon the bench. I ran sidelings upon it that way as fast as I could, banging the proper keys with my 2 sticks, and made a shift to play a jig with great satisfaction of both their majesties. But this was the most violent exercise I ever underwent, and yet I could not strike above 16 keys, nor consequently play the bass and treble together, as other artists do, which was a great disadvantage to my performance. The king, who, as I observed before, was a prince of excellent understanding, would frequently order that I should be brought in my box, and set upon the table of his closet. He would then command me to bring one of my chairs out of the box, sit within 3 yards distance from the top of the cabinet, which brought me almost to a level of his face. In this manner I had several conversations with him. I one day took the freedom to tell his majesty that the contempt he discovered towards Europe and the rest of the world did not seem answerable to those excellent qualities of his mind he was a master of. Reason did not extend itself with the bulk of its body, and, contrary, we observed in our country that the tallest persons were usually least provided with it, that among other animals bees and ants had a reputation of more industry, art, and sagacity than many of the larger kinds, and that as inconsiderable as he took me to be, I hoped I might live to do his majesty some signal service. The king heard me with attention, and began to conceive a much better opinion of me than he ever before. He desired I would give him as exact an account of the government of England as I possibly could, because, as fond as princes commonly are in their own customs, for he conjured from the other monarchs by my former discourse, he should be glad to hear anything that might deserve imitation. Imagine thyself, courteous reader, how often I then wished for the tongue of Demosthenes or Circio, that I might have been enabled me to celebrate the praises of my own dear native country in a style equal to its merits and felicity. I began my discourse by informing his majesty that our dominions consisted of 2 islands, which composed 3 mighty kingdoms over one sovereign. Besides our plantations in America, I dwelt long upon the fertility of our soil, the temperature of our climate. I then spoke at large upon the constitution of an English Parliament, partly made up of an illustrious body called the House of Peers, the persons of noblest blood, and those most ancient in ample patrimonies. I described that extraordinary care always taken to their education in arts and arms to qualify them for being counsellors born to the king and kingdom. to have a share in the legislature, to be members of the high court of the judicature, from whence there could be no appeal, to be champions, and always ready to defend their prince and country by their valor, conduct, and fidelity. Th- that these were the ornament and bulwark of the kingdom, worthy followers of their most renowned ancestors. Those honored had been the reward of their virtue, from which their posterity, which were never once known to degenerate, to these were joined by several holy persons, as part of that assembly, under the title of bishop, whose particular business it is to take care of the religion, and of those who instruct the people therein. These were searched and sought out through the whole nation by the prince and his wisest counselors, among such a priesthood as there were most deservedly distinguished by the sanity of their lives, and the depth of their erudition, who were indeed the spiritual fathers of clergy and the people. That the other part of the Parliament consisted of an assembly called the House of Commons, who were all principal gentlemen, freely picked and culled out by the people themselves, for their great ability and love of their country to represent the wisdom of the whole nation. And these two bodies make up the most august assembly in Europe, to whom, in conjunction with the prince, the whole legislature is committed. I then descended to the courts of justice, over which the judge, those venerable sages and interpreters of law, presided, for determining in the disputed rights and properties of men, as well as the punishment for of vice and protection of innocent. I mentioned the prudent management of our treasury, the valor and achievements of our forces by sea and land. I computed the number of our people, by reckoning how many millions there might be of each religious sect, or political party among us. I did not omit even our sports and pastimes, or any other particular which I thought might redound to the honor of my country. And I finished all with a brief historical account of affairs and events in England for about the in 100 years past. This conversation was not ended under 5 audiences, each of several hours, and the king heard the whole with great attention, frequently taking notes of what I spoke, as well as memorandums of several questions he intended to ask. When I had put an end to these long discourses, his Majesty, in a 6th audience, consulting his notes, proposed many doubts, queries, and objections upon every article. He asked what methods we used to cultivate the minds and bodies of our young nobility, and in what kind of business were they commonly spent the first and teachable part of their lives. What course was taken to supply that assembly when any noble family became extinct? What qualifications were necessary in those who were created new lords? Whether the humour of the prince, a sum of money to the court lady, or a prime minister, or a design of strengthening a party opposite to the public interest, ever happened to be motives in those advancements? What share of knowledge these lords had in the laws of their country, and how they came by it, so to enable them to decide the properties of their fellow subjects in the last resort, whether they were always so free from avarice, brutalities, or want that a bribe, or some other sinister view could have no place among them. Whether these holy lords I spoke of were always promoted to that rank upon account of their knowledge in religious matters, and the sanctity of their lives, had never been compare with these times, while they were common priests or slavish prostitutes chaplains to some noblemen, whose opinions they continued severely to follow after they were admitted to the assembly. He then desired to know what arts were practised in electing those who I called commoners, whether a stranger with a strong purse might not influence the vulgar voters to choose him before their own landlord, or the most considerable gentleman in the neighbourhood, how it came to pass that the people were so violently bent on getting into this assembly, which I allowed to be a great trouble and expense, to the often in ruin of their family, without any salary or pension, because this appeared such an exalted strain of virtue and public spirit, that his Majesty seemed to doubt it might possibly not always be sincere, and he desired to know whether such zealous gentlemen could have any views of refunding themselves for the charges and troubles that they were at, by sacrificing them the public good to the design of a weak and vicious prince in conjunction to corrupted ministry. He multiplied his questions, and sifted me through thoroughly on every part of this head, proposing numberless inquiries and objections, which I think is not prudent or convenient to repeat. Upon what I said in relation to our courts of justice, his Majesty desired to be satisfied in several points, and this I was better able to do, having been formerly almost ruined by a long suit in Chancery, which was decreed for me with costs. He asked what time was usually spent in determining between right and wrong, of what degree of expense, whether advocates or orators had liberty to plead in cause manifestly known to unjust, vexatious, or oppressive, whether the party in religion or politics were observed to be any weight in scale of justice, whether those pleading orators were persons educated in the general knowledge of equity, or only in provincial, national, and other local customs, whether they or their judges had any part in penning those laws, which they assumed the liberty of interpreting and the glossing upon at their pleasure, whether they had ever at different times pleaded for and against the same cause, and cited precedents to prove contrary opinions. They were a rich or poor corporation, whether they received any pecuniary reward for pleading or delivering their opinion, and particularly whether they were ever admitted as members in the lower senate. He fell next upon the management of our treasury, and said he thought my memory had failed me, because I computed our tax at about 5 or 6 million a year. And when I came to mention the issue, he found they sometimes amounted to do more than double. The notes he had taken were very particular in this point, because he hoped, as he told me, that the knowledge of our very conduct would be useful to him, and he could not be deceived in his calculations. But if what I told him was true, he was still at loss how a kingdom can run out of its estate like a private person. He asked me who were our creditors, and where we should find money to pay them. He wondered to hear me talk such chargeable and extensive wars, that certainly we must be quarrelsome people, or live among very bad neighbors, and that our generals must need to be richer than our kings. He asked what business we had out of our own islands, upon the score of trade or treaty, or to defend the coasts of our fleet. Above all, he was amazed to hear me talk of a mercenary standing army in the midst of peace, among a free people, and said, if we were governed by our own consent in the persons of our representatives, he could not imagine of whom we were afraid, or against whom we were to fight. And he would hear my opinion, whether a private man's house might not better be defended by himself, his children, and family, than by the half a dozen rascals picked up in the venture at a street, for small wages, who might get 100 times more cutting in their throat. He laughed at my odd kind of arithmetic, as he was pleased to call it, in reckoning the numbers of our people by a computation drawn from several sects in religion and politics. He said he knew no reason why those who entertain opinions prejudicial to the public should be obliged to change, or should not be obliged to conceal them, and it was tyranny in any government to require the first, so it was a weakness not to enforce the second, for a man may be allowed to keep his poisons in his closet, but not vend them about for corridors. He observed that among the diversions of our nobility in country I mentioned gaming. He desired to know at what age this entertainment was usually taken up, and when it was laid down, how much time it was employed, whether it went so high to affect their fortunes, whether mean, vicious people, by their dexterity in that art, might not arrive at great riches, and sometimes keep our very nobles in dependence, as habituate them in vile companions, wholly take them from improvement of their minds, force them by the losses they have received to learn practice that infamous dexterity upon the others. He was perfectly astonished with the historical accounts I gave him of our affairs during the last century, protesting it was just in a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishments, the very worst effect that avarice, faction, hypocrisy, perfidiousness, cruelty, rage, madness, hatred, envy, lust, malice, or ambition could produce. His Majesty, in another audience, was at the pain to recapitulate the sum of all I had spoken, compare the questions he made with the answers I have given, then taking me into his hand, and stroking me gently, delivered himself these words, which I shall never forget, nor the manner he spoke them in. My little friend Grildrig, you have the most admirable panegyric of your country. You have clearly proved that ignorance, idleness, and vice are the proper ingredients for qualifying a legislature, that laws are the best explained, interpreted, and applied by those whose interest and abilities lie in perverting, confounding, and eluding them. I observed among you some lines of an institution, which in original might have been tolerable, but these half erased, that the rest wholly blurred and blotted by corruptions. It doth not appear from all you have said, how any one virtue is required towards the procurement of any one station among you, much less that men are ennobled on account of their virtue, and that priests are advanced for their piety or learning, soldiers for their conduct or valor, judges for their integrity, senators for the love of your country, or counselors for their wisdom. As for you, continued the king, who had spent the greatest part of your life in travelling, I am well disposed to hope you may hitherto have escaped many vices of your country. But, by what I have gathered from your own relation, the answers I have with much pain wringed and extorted from you, I cannot but conclude the bulks of your natives to be the most poisonous race of little odious vermin that nature has ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth.